Hi, it's Friday. I'm John Zogby, and that means this is another edition in our series of podcasts, the Zogby Report, Real and Unscripted. Although we're doing something a little different today, we're doing a shortened version because my managing partner, as well as son, Jeremy, is doing what a good pollster should be doing. He's in New Hampshire, been there for a couple of days, will be coming home very soon, and he's on the ground. He's scoping out the territory, talking to party leaders and campaign leaders, and as well, he's talking to members of the general public and taking down some notes. And I say that he's doing what he should be doing because what I want to talk about today is how to read polls and what to look for and what to not look for and not to expect. And I'm using Jeremy's trip to New Hampshire as a lesson that kind of defines what I'm going to be talking about. Because essentially, what I want you to understand is that we pollsters, we poll people. We don't poll numbers. That's very important. To be sure, conducting good polls, we need a goal of random probability sampling. We need to make sure that our stats are in order and clear, and that our final product reflects as best as we can what we believe the turnout model in an election should be. But ultimately, what we're really talking about are talking to hundreds and thousands and ultimately tens of thousands of real people. When you talk to people one at a time, they're complex and they're interesting and often unpredictable. And frankly, when you talk to them hundreds and thousands at a time, you multiply all those complexities and all those sources of error. The statistics have to be right. But ultimately, what our job is to read people's feelings and to do that as accurately as we can. And in books that I've written 3, and in fact, I'm in the process of writing a 4th one entitled How to Read Polls. What I talk about is our role as pollsters, as being students of history, being students of social sciences, especially being students of the humanities and the arts, of being able to understand people in the fullness of who each individual may be and who groups of people may be. That's a tall order, but that's what you get when you purport to study people. Every poll has its sources of error. Even the best pollsters will tell you that each poll that comes out has a 95% confidence rate. Now, what that means in the positive is quite good. That if we follow the rules of engagement and seek the random probability sampling, although that's a fleeting kind of goal these days, but if we do the poll the same way, we will get the same results 95 times out of 100, plus or minus what the margin of error is. So if it's 1,000 likely voters or adults, around plus or minus 3 or 3.2, either way. The nasty little secret that we often don't talk about enough is that means that there's a 5% chance of missing that margin of error, of having the outlier or the black swan, or let's just say a very bad couple of days. And so that's the sort of thing that makes us human, and that we would appreciate that our readers and commentators would understand as well. I've had my 5%ers, pretty much everybody has, and so we pollsters come to you not as oracles, but we come to you as fellow human beings trying to read your minds. We've had some bad years, we've had some good years, but I want to clarify in this abbreviated version. Yes, there are biases, but yes, there are ways to do outtakes and eliminate the obvious biases. One of the worst examples of polling bias that I have seen came just this past year in 2022. You may recall a lot of talk about the big red wave and about how the Republicans were going to sweep the House of Representatives by big margins. And in fact, in doing numerous TV interviews with Republican pollsters, they talked about, and I quote, winning in places where no one would believe that Republicans would win. Of course, they were also strongly suggesting that the Republicans would take over the United States Senate. That didn't happen. And basically, what was going on there were not only Republican voter turnout models. That's a very legitimate thing to do. We pollsters always have to try to, put our artistic cap on and try to project, based on history and based on the polling that we're doing, what the turnout demographically and attitudinally is going to look like on election day. But what happened in this instance was that I was on a number of times with active Republican pollsters who were also spinning and were taking their numbers, which were pro-Republican numbers, and using them to cheerlead and to project that there would be a big red wave. And I was very much opposed to that. And I was equally opposed to the fact that what I call the aggregation industrial complex were partners in that kind of cheerleading, meaning that they would include the polls of Trafalgar and Remington, to some degree Insider Advantage, clear Republican polls that were far different from other mainstream and more independent polls. And the places like Real Clear Politics, 538, and so on would include these polls within the average. What that's misleading. That's adding error to what's supposed to be objectivity. And I think the thing that I saw that was most troubling of all in 2022, most notably, is that these polls would come out just as a Democratic candidate was making headway, making progress, building into very close races, of course, 2 and 3 and 4-point leads, and then bam, out would come a Trafalgar poll with a Republican up by 2. It would skew the average and suggest momentum in a different way. And I thought that I'm certainly not suggesting conspiracy. I'm suggesting that aggregators, just like pollsters, have our sources of errors, and that we all need to take a close look at what we're doing and try to do it better. And that's one instance where the aggregators like Real Clear and 538 and so on need to take a long look at what they do and how they do it. We don't predict, and I need to warn you of that. Now, I built a reputation on, quote, predicting races, particularly some races in the 90s and in the last decade, well, 2 decades ago, that no one else got right. But I always knew that that was going to be a slippery slope, being the one to be perfect and being right all the time. And so I tried to train my employees to just be smarter, to try to look for things that others don't look. It's much better to be the smartest pollster than to be the most accurate pollster. But predictions are soft and will remain to be. People change their minds. They even change their minds at the last minute. They change their minds from one candidate to undecided to another candidate, and can do that all in the course of 24 or 48 hours. Some decide at the last minute, and even decide ultimately, even though we weed out likely voters, to decide not to vote at all. So there's softness, and there can be change there. So you always want to look at the date of the poll. And if the poll closes too far in advance of election day, don't dismiss it, because as I'll point out in my book that hopefully will be out the early part of 24, there's still a lot of valuable information in the polls, but don't treat them as a predictor. The other thing I want to warn you about is that even though people are on television, and I've been one of them, and frequently over the decades span, that doesn't necessarily make us smart. Too often, the pundits that you see on television in particular, but also in print journalism and blogs and tweets and so on, are engaged in what we call confirmation bias. They talk to each other, and they weed out what they like, they weed in what they like, they weed out what they don't like, and ultimately come up with a conventional wisdom. And a conventional wisdom that they all kind of agree upon. This is what I think more than anything happened in 2016. I read those polls as they were coming out, especially in the last 2 weeks of the election. That, of course, was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. And what I saw was that 10 days to 2 weeks before the actual election day, Hillary Clinton had substantial leads in the battleground states. And then every couple of days, and particularly after the letter by James Comey saying that he was going to open up the investigation again of her emails at home, saw Hillary's numbers going down. And not Trump's necessarily going up, but Hillary's going down to the point where just prior to the election, Hillary may have still been leading, like in Pennsylvania, by 3, but she'd been up by 11 just 10 days before. In Wisconsin, she'd been up substantially and now was down a point. The wrong way to look at those polls was to say she still leads, she's going to win. The right way to look at those polls was to scratch your head and say, what about this trend line here? This trend line is moving away from her. And if she's up by 3, okay, that is pretty good in Pennsylvania. But why is it 3 as opposed to 9, 10, or 11 just several days ago? The vectors were there. I never said it's in the bag for Clinton. It's in the bag for Trump. In fact, if you look at my pieces on Forbes, there were 3 or 4 of them just over the weekend, the day before and the day of the election. I always indicated, look, there may be something going on here. That's the way to read polls, read the trend line. And so finally, just last year in 2022, Republicans were saying, and this was part of the spin, voters care only about inflation. And Democrats are not going to care about abortion. That issue burned itself out. They're not going to care about gun violence. That issue has come and gone. And the fact of the matter is that the exit polls on that day gave a strong indication of why Democrats had a much better day than folks had been expecting or that Republicans had been spinning. And that is because that by far and away the number one issue for Democratic voters was indeed abortion. That was the button that was pushed with the Dobbs decision in Mississippi in the Supreme Court. And guns came in at 14%, but was particularly high among 18 to 29-year-olds. In fact, was a major driver for why they turned out to vote. I hope that you found this short little lesson useful. It is an essential part of a much longer book that I'm writing about how to read polls, what they say and what they don't say, and how not to misread them. And we'll revisit these themes as we go along. I miss my partner and my son, but I can't wait for him to download what he saw and heard and felt in the state of New Hampshire. Thanks. We'll see you next week.